So, as mentioned earlier, in order to react to an offensive, there has to be a headquarters in supply and in range of at least one declared battle hex. So, for example, this one would be a very smart move by the Americans here, because by bringing Lexington and its ZOI over Truk and over the South Seas headquarters, suddenly this headquarters is out of supply and it cannot react. So because the ZOI is over here, no reaction can be made towards the other battle hexes, and the Allies can advance their offensive without hindrance. However, let's skip this for a while and move to see how battles are conducted. Any hexes that contain the offensive player's units and the reaction player's units must be declared as battle hexes, but if there are enemy units in range of your air carrier units, it is optional to declare a battle. So Lexington may just stay put in Kwajalein if it is Allied controlled, or it may declare a battle towards this hex, but Enterprise has to declare a battle in this hex because it is coexisting with a Japanese unit at Eniwetok. So one more thing about the special reaction created battle hexes. Again, the Japanese are trying to amphibious assault this one, which is Allied controlled in this example, and they also bring Zuiho here, and they declare that Zuiho will battle this air force. The Allies successfully roll for the creation of this battle hex, and they react. If Lexington comes here, for example, or here and participate in this battle, that's okay, they will both battle Zuiho, but if Lexington comes physically in the hex of the amphibious assault, in which Zuiho was declared to take place in this battle, then these units that are physically in the special reaction hex will switch to this battle, because they are here and the enemy unit is here, so they have to participate in this particular battle and not in this battle. So this is a rare case where they switch battle hex and participate in the battle in the hex that they are physically present. So the Americans have brought Lexington here in order to participate in this battle, and they also have brought this guy here, escorted by this naval unit. This is an amphibious assault, and control does not revert to the Allies unless the amphibious assault succeeds. So, first of all, which units participate in this battle? Of course, the units inside the hex participate, as well as all other units that have been declared by the offensive player to participate. For example, Lexington from this range, and possibly these air forces if activated and declared in battle by the allied player. However, because it is a range of 3 hexes to Eniwetok, they will participate from extended range, which means their attack strength will be halved. From 10 it goes to 5. And if there are fractions, they are always rounded up. Now the reaction player will participate with these units, of course, and may also activate this unit to attack from range, or possibly bring other units to participate under the rules that we have already mentioned. Also worth noticing that this one cannot participate for the Allies because it is within its extended range, so it cannot use its range of 4 to participate in a battle that is 4 hexes away. Now, after determining which units participate in this battle, there is a 2-steps procedure. First, we have the air-naval battle, in which only air and naval units participate, and after that we may possibly have ground combat. So, since there are air and naval units from both sides, they will be participating. In order to conduct the air-naval battle, we roll the die. Each player rolls the die, and we consult the results of the die roll. It goes from 0 to 9, I remind, and there's a beautiful chart indicating the result of its die roll. Generally, if you roll from 0 to 2, the damage you're gonna deal is 1/4 of your total attack factors, which is your total attack strength in the battle. if you roll 3 to 5, then it is half your total strength. And if it is 6 to 9, it is a 1 result, which means the total of your attack factors. So for example, in this case, the Americans have New Orleans with a total attack strength of 9, Lexington with a total attack strength of 12, and the 7th Air Forces with a total attack strength of 5, because it is halved. So the total is 26. So if they roll 0, 1 or 2, we have a quarter result, which means 26 divided by 4 means 6.5. And fractions are always rounded up, so they can deal 7 points of damage. And they can use these points of damage or attack factors in order to reduce or eliminate enemy air or naval units. So if the result is 1/4, which results in 7 as we mentioned, they have to overcome the defenses of the units, and as we see, they can do nothing. They can neither flip Tenryu because it has a defense of 8, nor flip Shokaku because it has a defense strength of 12. If they roll a 3 to 5 result, this is a half times result, which means their total of 26 factors is divided by 2 and results in 13 damage. In this case, they can either flip Tenryu or Shokaku, but not both. They have to choose, and it is the offensive player choice. I mean, the players who roll the die. And if this Air Force was participating as well, then they can flip this one alternatively. Now, if they roll a 6 result or higher, this is a 1 times result, which means their total of 26 can be fully applied. In this case, the most logical thing to do would be to flip the Shokaku and the Air Force, which are the strongest Japanese units, with a total of 12 and 10 for a sum total of 22. Additionally, if they manage to roll a 9, this is a critical hit. There are some modifiers to the die, but when referring to the critical hit, it has to be an unmodified 9, thus a pure 9 before any modifications are accounted for. So if they roll a 9, this is a critical hit, and this means 2 things. First of all, there is a restriction that before eliminating a unit, you first have to flip all participating units in battle. So in a normal non-critical result, you would have to first flip all participating units and then choose to possibly eliminate one. However, if you have rolled a critical hit, then you can use your full 1 times result, which in this case is 26, in order to circumvent this restriction. And for example, flip and subsequently eliminate Shokaku, which is the pride of the Japanese Navy, and send it to the dead pile. Also notice that some units have again this yellow dot, which means that if they are reduced or eliminated, they cannot be flipped back or come back from the dead during the replacement segment. So, by this critical hit, you can flip and then eliminate any unit that you want, regardless of whether there are other non-flipped full-strength units in the battle. And there is also one more benefit of achieving the critical hit. This is, if you are otherwise mathematically unable to deal a hit, so for example, if Tenryu is fighting these 2 naval units alone and it rolls a critical, in this case it is unable to mathematically deal a hit. But with a critical hit, you can choose and deal 1 step of damage that goes to the unit with the lowest defense strength, which in this case would be New Orleans. So because, and only because they rolled a 9, they can use their attack factors of 4, which is otherwise insufficient, and damage the unit with the lowest defense strength. However, there is one more restriction to be seriously taken into account. As mentioned, there can be many units in the hex and other units that are participating from outside the hex, thanks to their range. For every unit that you wish to damage outside the battle hex, you have to have an equal number of ranged units participating in the battle. So, for example, if the Americans have brought New Orleans and Lexington into this fight, but not activated this Air Force, and suppose they have also brought US Asia with them, and they roll a 1 times result, which results in a total loss factor of 12, 21, 25. In this case, they would normally be able to flip both these units for a total of 22, but they can't, because they only have one ranged unit being able to fire at a long distance, and these are two ranged units outside the hex. So a smart thing to do would have been to activate this air force prior to the battle, even with this reduced strength of its. And in this way, they would have two ranged units, which would be able to damage these units that are outside the hex. Barely worth mentioning that if Shokaku was in the hex, then it would receive the hits normally, regardless of the number of ranged units present. And this means that another option of the Japanese player as a reaction is the following, and this would be a really smart move if you ask me. Suppose the American player has only brought these naval units to the combat, and the Japanese have these units participating, this air force and these two naval units. In reaction, the Japanese player can activate this unit to exit the battle hex. And yes, units can be activated to exit the battle hex, but they have to participate in the battle regardless. So they cannot move much far, they have to be within range of the hex. And if it was an air force leaving the hex, for example, it would have to go to a friendly airport, of course. Now, in this case, because the Japanese have activated the Shokaku out of the hex, now the American player only has one carrier or only one ranged unit participating in the battle. So even if they roll their much desired one result, then their total number of 25 cannot damage both the Shokaku and the air flotilla, because these are two ranged units and they only have one ranged unit. So their choice would be either to flip Tenryu and the flotilla or Tenryu and Shokaku. And that's it. They cannot reduce this further because of the presence of the full-strength air unit also participating. Also, if you recall, we had mentioned that a naval unit may move at a hex from which a friendly aircraft carrier unit can participate in the battle in order to escort it. So, for example, if the Japanese have moved Shokaku and Tenryu here, so Tenryu is stacked with Shokaku. In this case, Tenryu has moved from another hex, not originally participating in the battle, and its sole reason for finding itself here is to provide help to Shokaku. In this case, this becomes part of the loss procedure, which means if the Americans, for example, roll a 1 times result, and suppose this one is not participating in the battle, this would be one step here, and even if they have enough attack strength remaining, they cannot hit the Shokaku again because Tenryu is shielding it, and they have to first reduce Tenryu, which is full strength. So if you can escort your carrier with a full strength, otherwise inferior naval unit, it can be a good shield for it to prevent it from being totally eliminated. As I mentioned, there's a number of modifiers for the battle, and particularly for the air-naval combat, which are the following. If we're talking about surprise attack, which means either the reaction player failed his intelligence roll, or the military event played by the offensive player specifically stated that this is a surprise attack, and yes, there is a number of offensive cards that state that their condition is by default surprise attack, and unless an intelligence card is played against it, it is a surprise attack. In this case, there is a +3 modifier for the offensive player, so they're more likely to achieve a favorable result. Also, if we've got a US ambush, then it is a +4 on the die roll for the allied player. And lastly, if we are talking about years 1943 onwards, we've got a +1 if there is a US air or carrier unit participating in the battle. And if we're in 1944 or 1945, it is a +3 for the allied players die roll if there is a US air or aircraft carrier participating. So as you may notice yourselves, things get very dire for the Japanese as we progress towards the end of the game. And also there is a number of modifiers from event cards, but this is very situational. Now, who is the player who actually wins the air-naval combat? The winner is the one who, after all losses applied, remains with the most attack factors in battle. So, after some steps that have possibly been applied, we again count the total strength of the reaction player and the offensives player. Units that had their attack strength halved due to extended range continue to have this factor halved. And the one who has the most strength remaining is the winner of the air-naval combat, which does not mean a whole lot, except that if they are conducting an amphibious assault, the ground combat will happen for the amphibious landing, which in reverse means that if the offensive player, the one who is conducting the amphibious assault, loses the air-naval combat and the reaction player has more strength remaining, then the amphibious landing is meant to be failed and the unit has to be returned or conduct post-naval movement like a naval unit to exit the hex, and control for the hex is not altered. If there is a tie regarding the factors remaining for each side, the reaction player wins ties during air-naval combat. Exception: if all units have been eliminated from both sides, this is considered an offensive player's victory. Exception number 2: if the offensive player is left without any air or carrier units, then he loses the battle if the reaction player has got one or more air units or aircraft carriers. So for example, if this was the case, say these 4 US naval units attacked Eniwetok and the Shokaku managed to sink the Lexington, then you will notice that the total strength of the American player is 15 and the Americans are remaining with 14, but they are still considered to have won the air-naval combat because of the presence of the aircraft carrier, while the offensive player has no aircraft carrier or air units remaining. One last detail about the battle and step losses that I would like to mention is that the Japanese are meant to have a naval advantage when they've got more than one carriers in battle. If one of their carriers suffers damage, they can transfer the hit suffered onto another carrier unit, which means if the Americans hit the Shokaku, the Japanese can opt to transfer one step of loss instead of Shokaku onto Akagi. So, as the Japanese, it's very often a good idea to bring some otherwise weak carriers with you so that they can absorb the damage. So, in this case, the Japanese have brought all these beautiful carriers together, and the Americans are trying to damage the pride of their navy, which is the flagship Shokaku. And the Japanese prefer to redirect this hit from Shokaku to Zuiho, which means auspicious phoenix for your info, because it is much weaker. But if they were to suffer a second step loss on Shokaku, they would not be able to transfer it. It's only for one step. And this is regardless of the damage inflicted. It's just a one step for one step.
So let's take this example. Both the carrier Zuiho and the battleship Hiei move together and they attack Lexington. But Hiei is out of range, so only Zuiho will be attacking and Hiei is just escorting, which means it does not contribute its attack factors. But if Lexington fires back, it has to first reduce Zuiho, and then it cannot eliminate Zuiho because of the presence of the full strength Hiei, so it has to first damage Hiei. In this case, Hiei is an escort, and as already mentioned, the winner of the battle in the air-naval combat part is the one who has the most attack factors remaining after the exchange of blows, and in this case, the escorting unit will not contribute its attack strength in this case either. So it will only be Lexington vs the Zuiho. We ignore these 17 attack factors for determining the winner of the air-naval combat. Worth noting that since some units have only one step, for example, this Marine Air Wing, cannot be reduced. It only has got one step. So in order to eliminate it, you have to first reduce this one, which is full strength. And now you have the choice to either reduce this one if you have remaining loss factors to apply, or this one you can do it in either order. So this is treated as a reduced strength unit. You can only destroy it when there are no other full strength units remaining.
If during an air-naval combat only one side has air-naval units and the other side only has ground units, then during the air-naval combat the air and naval units can hit the ground units in the hex. And if enough damage is generated to eliminate all ground units, then one last ground step always remains alive. And the choice regarding this last step belongs to the reaction player. So for example, if the Japanese attack this stack and they achieve a 1 times result, which in this case would be 19, and it is enough to eliminate these guys, then the American player will choose which one is the last ground step remaining alive in the hex, and of course they would probably choose to lose this guy and keep the Americans alive, which are stronger. Note that as part of the reaction player may bring ground units into the hex, despite the fact that oftentimes a ground combat would not take place at all and it would only be air-naval combat. So they can bring this guy even if he won't be taking place in a ground combat, it will only be an air-naval among these units. So, as already mentioned, if the offensive player or the active player conducts an amphibious assault, in order for this guy to stay here and conduct any possible ground battle, the air-naval combat has to be won, so you have to have more factors remaining than the enemy after the air-naval combat. Otherwise, this one guy has to conduct post-battle movement like a ship to possibly a friendly port, and the reaction player can react with as many air-naval units as he can based on his efficiency rating and logistics value. And for the logistic value, you always count the OP value of the offensive player's card. And they can also use one and only one amphibious shipping point to react with a ground unit amphibiously assaulting. So in this case, they can use this guy under the same requirement that because he will land in a hex with an enemy naval unit, he has to be escorted by the naval unit for his whole duration of the movement. So if HA and the SNLFs start here, they can together move as a stack, and in this way we're spending one amphibious shipping point for this SNLF, and he amphibiously assaults here as a reaction. And then we will have both a naval battle and possibly a ground battle if the offensive's player wins the air-naval combat and is able to conduct the ground combat. Otherwise he has to turn back. But this does not apply to the reaction player. Whether he wins the air-naval combat or loses, his amphibious assaulting unit will stay in the island. And as previously mentioned, it will have its defense strength reduced to half. So both this unit, the offensive player's one, and this one, the reaction player's one, because they conducted amphibious assault, their defense will be reduced to 3. So in this case, suppose the battle is won by the allies, this one will not be forced to turn back, and we will have a ground combat among these two guys. Now, on to ground combat. Let's assume that the battle is taking place in Port Moresby, the southern port and the capital of New Guinea. And by the way, you can not amphibiously assault mountain hexes. You can amphibiously assault any other hexes, but not mountains. The exception being Port Moresby itself. Although it is a mountain, you can amphibiously assault it, and the Japanese tried it historically, so it might be a good idea for you to try it, but most likely not. Anyway, the battle is taking place here. The Japanese might have proceeded overland from Buna, for example, or may have conducted an amphibious assault. And as we mentioned previously, If the air-naval battle is won by the offensive player, then the amphibious assault will proceed to the next step, which is the ground combat. If it is units proceeding over land, they are not particularly affected by the outcome of the air-naval combat, except for some modifiers that we are going to talk about right next. However, if there is a mixture of units, some of them invading through amphibious assault, in which case they would most likely be escorted by a naval unit, and other units have advanced overland. In this case, if the offensive player loses the battle, then only the amphibiously assaulting units will be forced to conduct post-battle movement, and the units that advanced overland will participate in the battle normally. Now, let's talk about the specifics of the ground combat. Again, both players will roll their dice. And for the offensive player, there is a negative modifier depending on the terrain type on the battle hex. So, for mountain hexes, it's -3 for the offensive player. For mixed hexes, it is -2, and for jungle hexes, it is -1. For clear terrain like this one, or for one hex atolls, for example, like this one, there is no negative modifier. Also, if after the conclusion of the air-naval combat, the offensive player is the only one to have naval units in the hex, they enjoy a +2 modifier. If they are the only ones to have aircraft units or aircraft carrier units in the hex, they enjoy a +2, which means, yes, you were correct to assume that. If they are the only ones to have a carrier unit there, it provides both the modifiers, both for the naval unit, which is naval superiority or naval bombardment, and for the aircraft/aircraft carrier superiority. So they enjoy a +4 modifier, which will probably mitigate the -3 that they suffered due to the terrain being mountain. Now, for the reaction player, they enjoy a +3 die roll modifier if they had ground units in the hex prior to the offensive, and the offensive player entered through amphibious assault. Once more, if they entered through amphibious assault, then the reaction player enjoys a +3 modifier in their die during the ground combat, but this only if they had ground units here. If they just brought units in reaction, then they don't enjoy this +3 modifier. And one last note is that amphibiously assaulting units defend at half their defense strength, rounded up. So for example, if this unit invades amphibiously, it's considered to have a defense strength of 6, while this one enjoys a defense strength of 12. And if this guy amphibiously assaulted in reaction, his defense strength will be just 3, half rounded up. Which practically means that amphibious landing is a very hard operation to take place, and until you set yourselves on the beach, the enemy has set up machine guns and guns possibly targeting you, which makes it a hard procedure, and this is all abstracted by the die roll modifiers. However, in ground combat, and unlike the air-naval combat, hits are applied simultaneously, regardless of the intelligence condition, whether it is surprise or ambush or intercept. It does not matter. Both sides roll their dice and apply their hit simultaneously. And as you are gonna see, the results are even more brutal, which is for a 0-2 result, after all modifications, they deal half their total attack's strength as damage. Again, there's the same restrictions that you first have to flip all full strength units and then possibly eliminating a unit. On a die roll of 3-6, it is a result of 1 times your strength. On a 7 and 8, the result is 1.5 times your attack strength. And on a result of 9, this is no critical hit, this just means that it's 2 times your attack strength as a result. Lastly, there is a number of die roll modifiers due to events, and a modifier of +1 for the allied player if the British 7th Armored Brigade is participating in the battle, which is a funny one unit because it also carries the exception that because it is a tank, it is not amphibious assault capable like the rest of British units. Actually, the 7th Armored Brigade can conduct strategic ground transport by sea, but it cannot conduct actual amphibious assault. and it cannot enter mountain hexes because it is a tank. The only way to enter mountain hexes is either by strategic ground transport or via a transportation route. In order to gain the +2 die roll modifier for a naval unit present in the battle during the ground combat, the naval unit has to be inside the hex. But in order for the other +2 die roll modifier for air or carrier units present in the battle, they can be outside the hex. So for example, if Enterprise is 2 hex away from the ground battle taking place here, then it only offers the +2 modifier for air or carrier units participating in the battle, but they will not offer the +2 modifier for naval units being inside the hex, for which they would have to be inside the battle hex. As for who wins the ground combat, if only one side remains with units alive, then this side is considered to have won the ground combat. But if ground units from both sides remain in the hex, then we count the total step losses. So who inflicted the most losses in steps, be it reducing units or eliminated units, is considered the winner of the ground combat. So in case of a tie, for example, if these two guys did not manage to destroy this one and nobody was damaged, in this case the reaction player is considered to have won the ground combat. Now, if the reaction player won, the offensive player has to retreat. But if the offensive players won and there are reaction players units remaining, he decides where to retreat these remaining enemy units. And of course, after concluding the battle, if it was a reaction player's victory, then control of the hex does not change. And if it was an offensive player's victory, he gains control of the hex. Also, there's the need for a retreat move after a ground combat, possibly. So, when an offensive unit enters the hex by ground movement and fails to win the battle, it has to retreat to the hex it came from. If it wins the battle, then the offensive player moves the unit into an adjacent hex, which is not the one from which the offensive unit entered the hex. So in this case, it would have to be this one. Or if it was an amphibious assault, it would have to be retreated into one of these two hexes. But if possible, it has to be a named location where the unit is in supply. So this one, because it is Japanese controlled and it is a named location, would be the hex of priority and not this one. I remind, this move is made by the offensive player, so he chooses. However, if there is no such legal hex, or the battle occurred in a one hex island like this one, when there is no adjacent hex for the unit to retreat by ground movement, then the unit is eliminated. And also one last restriction is that the hex you are retreating the unit to must not cause an overstack. If there is no friendly hex with a named location that would not cause an overstack, then any other legal location may be selected.